this is your first time hanging out with MobilisationLab or the Mobilization Lab, welcome. We exist to help social change campaigners and their organizations be more effective with advocacy and campaigning, to be able to deliver more participatory, people-powered campaigns, to be more collaborative and creative internally with their own teams and departments, externally with allies and movements, and to take more systemic approaches so that we can truly tackle the giant challenges of our time. Obviously, you can imagine there are so many great strategies and tactics that we love learning from every single day about how to do that well. We also train, coach, build other people's capacity to do that. But underneath all of that, we find that it really takes a willingness to be able to adapt and integrate new ways of working. So those are all nice values and ideas, but until the rubber hits the road, in our opinion, when you really try to shift how your team and your organization is working. So that's why I am particularly excited about this conversation with Hanna. I think she represents one of the few great examples and stories of someone making huge strides in an organizational transformation project, looking at what's next when it comes to how we support and resource our grassroots organizers, our different colleagues and allies around the world in our organizations. And so we're gonna ask Hanna to introduce herself in just a minute. I will just say that my name is Michael. I'm with the Mobilization Lab, lead the Mobilization Lab, but I'm also here with two colleagues who are not on screen right now, but are in this conversation through the chat and through Twitter. That's Sarah Ali and Jackie Howard here. So they are also joining us, if not visually today. So Hanna, hello again.
Hi. Hi.
Hello, there we go. Okay, you're on, you're live. Welcome. I'm so eager to dig into what's going on right now, but I wondering if you could just give us a little bit of your backstory, like how did you come to advocacy and campaigning?
Sure. This is really exciting. I can't believe all of the amazing people who have joined, so thank you for that. So firstly, I should say I'm based in London. I'm the Chief Product Officer at 350, and I've been at 350 for a year and a half. But the way I got into campaigning and advocacy was a bit of a strange route. I wasn't at all political when I was younger, but when I was about 24, I decided to start a website called Escape London. I had recently moved to London. I really hated it at the time, love it now, and wanted to, it was basically a travel website for people who couldn't drive or didn't have a car. And some people were like, oh, you know who would love that? Environmental people, like you should really do some research and apply for funding. And I did some research and did apply for funding and got it. And in the meantime, just completely kind of radicalized myself into sort of becoming an environmentalist. And after that, joined a grassroots organization called the Otesha Project that was focused on peer education around sustainability. Was very involved with the UK Youth Climate Coalition in its founding. And then founded the East London Green Jobs Alliance that was focused on bringing sort of marginalized young people into work in sustainability. And then after that, yeah, it was just a whole route of different things. I've worked for someofus.org for 5 years on corporate power and workers' rights, and I've done a lot of feminist and anti-racist work as well in the last few years. So it's a sort of gateway into lots of different activities for me over the last 12, 13 years.
Thanks. And so you've had an impressive number of titles and roles. I know some are say campaigner in them, some are organizer. It seems like you've run the full spectrum. Sounds like your first story had something to do with digital. I'm just curious, how do you identify with digital? Is that always been part of or is it, like you said in a lot of your writing, that like why we've been talking about, we'll get into this more, but yeah, even a appendage that we should be using anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that first website I built, I sort of taught myself some very basic WordPress skills and got a lot of help. But the majority of my work was offline until I started work with someofus.org, which is really like a very digital first organization, and was founded in, I want to say, 2012 or something like that. So, you know, just got up and running exactly when the Facebook algorithm was so favorable and when everything could go viral pretty easily. And that was when I picked up a lot of my sort of, digital skills, and it was the most incredible sort of training ground.
I want to dig more into 350 in a second. I just want to note that we have hundreds of questions that came in from all of you who joined, and so my attempt here is to weave in as much of that as possible as we chat with Hanna throughout the next 45 minutes. If you have questions that come up, you can use the Q&A function for those who are just joining, and we will keep an eye on that and weave those in. Hanna, give us just a snapshot of what 350, I mean, some people, so for me, I come from the climate movement in the US, and, you know, I think part of what's interesting about this story to me is that we're even having this conversation, right? Because 350 for many of us, when it started at, you know, before being a global campaign, started as a US campaign, not even an organization, in, is it 2009? Am I right? So almost 10 years ago, where it was, you mentioned digital first with some of us, so maybe even 5 years before some of us, it was kind of this cutting edge digital organizing, advocacy, and campaigning group. And so with, you know, 10 to 12 people, the legend and lore, right? It was 10 to 12 people who just graduated college and were able to use the internet to mobilize and spark all kinds of action, both nationally and internationally. So how would you, what is 350 today? Is it a global, is it in INGO, or, you know, when you've been there a year or so, right?
Yes, it's absolutely global. We have staff in, I think, 29 countries around the world now. And we obviously have a huge team in the States because that's where we were founded, and we have a big team there. But I can't think of another organization that tries to do the same thing that 350 does, which is operate as one, you know, as one team across the whole 24-hour time zone cycle. But with so many different on-the-ground campaigns around the world, all with their own political contexts and all with their different sort of theories of change. You know, 350 definitely did start with this mass mobilization, and still does. You know, we still organize days of action every year, but a huge piece of our work, which I think is less visible, is the on-the-ground organizing that we do with local groups around the world. And I would say, in my interview actually for my job last year, I made some reference. I was like, blah, 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 digital first organization. And someone was like, we're not digital first. And I was like, oh God, I've completely misunderstood.
But you were, weren't you?
Yeah, but I think from the outside, 350 really does seem that way, but it's not. You know, I think at the moment, the kind of message I'm trying to build internally is that we want to be a digital critical organization, even if we're not digital first.
Digital critical, interesting.
Yeah, and but you know, I think we're pretty clear as an organization that the sort of focus of our work is in building face-to-face relationships. So everything serves that end at the end of the day.
I mean, you've mentioned from the outside, we're going to talk so much about the, you know, how does digital get structured and resourced internally, just externally. From a supporter perspective, is there still a useful designation at all? A number of people, a lot of questions just came in about, you know, how do you connect digital with offline campaigning? What is the online to offline connection? And so, yeah, I'd love to hear just a bit more culturally, internally, you know, has it been two separate things where you have the people who are in groups and the people supporting and organizing all those local groups around the world are, you know, is that volunteers, and then you have digital that's doing social and the website, and it's like a separate thing, or is everyone see it as digital critical? And how does that work from a kind of an individual perspective on the ground?
Yeah, well, certainly when I walked in last year, I think that online offline distinction was a huge part of how things had been structured. We had this, maybe I can go into a bit more detail in a minute about how it was all operating, but there was a big digital team that was separate from our programs team. So it was like, you guys do the online stuff, we'll go out and sort of be on the front lines. And when I was doing sort of the assessment and the interviews that went into the recommendations that we implemented subsequently, I was going through my notes in preparation for this, and someone had said, you know, the online to offline distinction is a pretty 2012 way of talking about things. And I was like, that is so right. You know, I really agree with that. I think now you can't get away with being an offline organizer. I can't even really think of what that would mean. You know, everyone needs some sort of connection, whether you want to like live stream your event, input someone's contact details straight away into your CRM, use a call tool, you know, to like follow up with people after meetings. I'm not sure that anyone now, if you were wanting to like hire an organizing team, those sort of skills are really critical, I think, to making that team a success, in a way that maybe was less obvious, you know, however many years ago.
Right. And I have to just throw in this one more, this quick asterisk question, because you're a global organization, you're working in so many countries where digital access is not 100%. And so a number of people, we have a colleague in Fiji who asked about this, you know, a number who said, you know, just how do you, there is actually an offline, isn't there, for a number of communities?
Yeah.
And how does that
Absolutely. You know, yeah, we have a team in the Pacific where email is just really not a priority. You know, no one is going to like organize via email in the Pacific. That's totally fine. But, you know, what our Pacific team does do is tell stories, you know, and they are one of our biggest sort of content making teams in terms of the videos and the writing and the photographs that come out of their experience. And it's so important. So, you know, a lot of the trainings we do with them are, how do you frame a story correctly? You know, not correctly, but you know what I mean? Like in a way that is going to galvanize people. And so they get storytelling trainings and smartphone kits and things like that. And in other places in the world, we are trying to look into tools that will work offline and then can sync, you know, so if you're at an event, you don't have a Wi-Fi and you don't have data, that you can still collect people's contact details, but then you get back to wherever you have a connection, your laptop, and you can sort of upload all that stuff. So, you know, sure, in different contexts, you're going to organize in different ways, but I think in a world where we want to build these lasting relationships to be able to keep people coming into the movement and staying in the movement, when it comes to relationship building, I mean, I can't think of how you can build those lasting relationships without some way of connecting with people on digital as well as offline platforms. Part of
the tool set. Yeah, but not the only tool set. Yeah, okay, I hear you. So for those who like to know a little bit more in advance where we're heading, the conversation that Hannah and I are going to be having here with your questions over the during this hour, we're going to start digging into what Hannah found when she first arrived, and this whole nature of what does it mean to decentralize digital, and then we're going to go into the nuts and bolts of what some of the teams and structures and systems are that Hannah has been busy setting up and that many of you have been reading about. And then we're going to finish talking a bit about how to do this, how to make organizational change, how to drive these cultural shifts internally. So what does that internal campaign look like? And hopefully that will have a lot of useful takeaways for all of us who are in similar boats. So that's the forecast, and appreciate those of you who are dropping in questions to the Q&A. We are also going to be experimenting with some collaborative note-taking and a Google Doc, which we'll drop in the chat as well. And of course, the the hashtag 350 digital transformation if you prefer Twitter. Okay, Hannah, sorry, that clap was probably too loud. I will not do that. You came on, you were hired with a different title initially, right? You came in as digital director, what, just over a year ago, is it?
In February last year, so like over a year and a half ago now.
Okay, so a lifetime ago?
Yeah, 3 lifetimes.
What you've been doing? Okay. Can you give us a snapshot of what you found? You were hired, there was, and also just, you know, why did they hire you? Obviously, there's a million reasons to hire you, but like, why did they recruit you in particular for this challenge? What did they think was happening at 350? And what did you see there?
Yeah, I think by the time I came into 350, they were pretty self-aware that there was some work to be done to sort of catch 350 back up to being at the cutting edge of digital technologies and digital organizing. And part of the process they had been through is they hadn't had a permanent digital director in place for a couple of years before I was hired. Like different internal people had sort of been handed the mantle, but they hadn't had a place on the leadership team, which is what I had from the beginning. And they also hadn't really had access to the same resources because of that. So I think the people who had led the digital team prior to me had done a really valiant effort to kind of keep things going, keep things rolling, but they hadn't been able to make a wholesale pitch to change stuff up. And as a result, the team itself was really overworked, pretty confused in terms of like all the different things that they were being asked to do. And they were like fairly misunderstood by the rest of the organization as well. And I think for the rest of the leadership team who didn't have a digital background in any way, they sort of knew that something needed to change, but weren't quite sure what. And when I walked in, you know, I saw a group of people. The digital team at the time was about 35 people, made up of all kinds of different things to do with buttons, you know, so there were video production, coding and building websites, writing emails, IT support, you know, was sort of like a little bit of everyone's job because they get harassed by everyone else. And just anything you could think of to do with a computer sort of got, you know, put on this team, and they dealt with it amazingly well, but it was hard. It was really hard. And yeah, and I think in that environment, you can't really take a step back and think, what is the strategic roadmap for our tool set over the next 2 to 3 years? Right. Or you can't think, actually, we make all these amazing videos every week, but what's our distribution strategy for getting a high count in a world where the Facebook algorithm isn't that favorable anymore? So yeah, when I came in, it was very, it was this sort of like gang of people who were doing the best that they could, but hadn't really had the support or the backing, I suppose, to really make a big change.
And would you say that, do you find, I see a lot of digital teams now where people are specializing. And so I'm curious, as you're describing all the things that people were doing, was that because there were a dozen specialists where someone who just writes email and someone, or was it just that everyone was overloaded doing a Swiss Army knife?
Yeah, it was a mix. There was, so maybe I should pull up this slide of the structure that I walked into. Which will confuse absolutely everyone, and that's fine because it is wildly confusing. It was based on this structure called the hybrid model that came out of the 2011 net change report. There's been another net change report since in 2018, which I'd recommend people reading. But yeah, the hybrid model sort of talks about having this central digital team that then kind of has people in different outposts in the rest of the organization that are their point people. Right. So we had digital campaigners and organizers in all of our regional teams. This was me, and the central digital team was made up of a mix of specialists and strong generalists. So it had our two developers and a designer, and then a social media person, and then the rest was sort of a mix of trying to think through digital tactics, trying to write emails, trying to think about our tool set, all at the same time. And it's interesting because obviously all of those people do have to coordinate in some ways, but in my mind, that's not the most logical mix of people to be coordinating with each other all the time. It's like, if you have people thinking about digital campaign tactics and strategy, they should really be embedded in the conversations and at the table where overall campaign and programmatic strategy is being thought about and negotiated. And they really weren't at the table at that time. So yeah, I'll stop sharing that now.
Interesting. So, and was that something that you think happened organically? I hear you on it. It reflects the hybrid model. Was that an intentional growth, or was it, over time, this was kind of an organic evolution, do you think?
The hybrid model, was it an organic evolution? That's such an interesting question. I'm not sure how they landed on it. I think it was a decision. Yeah. And I think there had been a few different experiments prior to this, but this formation had been in existence for, I believe, a couple of years before me joining.
Or maybe I guess perhaps the better question is, like, how did, given what you've described, how similar is that to what you would call, if it's fair to have a traditional digital team in 2019,
yeah,
we're about to talk about you moving to something, at the leading edge, or a new model, but
yeah,
how much does this reflect what you've seen at some of us, at other places you've been? Yeah, you have lots of different places. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't reflect like a digital first organization at all.
Okay.
And I think my experience of sort of starting my sort of purer campaign career at some of us really gave me this inverse perception at 350. I think if you came into 350 from an older organization, one of the bigger hitters, and came into 350, you might be like, wow, they're so nimble and this and that. But that absolutely wasn't my experience moving from a smaller, newer digital first organization into 350. I think, where a digital first things become more complex, right? When you have an online and a huge offline program, an organizing program, then you have to think, okay, what skills does everyone really need? It's not realistic to do what we did at some of us, which was rotate people around teams all the time. Everyone would have a go in the online fundraising team, or have a go in the sort of growth team, and different campaigns teams. That's not ever going to work at somewhere like 350. But there are ways in which to skill people up and try and get them in the right rooms. I don't know if that makes much sense.
Yeah, and I think, well, you mentioned these traditional groups. I think, we have perhaps hundreds of people here representing those organizations. So I guess they'll tell us here in a minute to what extent the model you found actually represents the status quo at most of these places or not. I have one other question for you here in terms of what you found. Oh, you have those.
I'm going to have to turn my light back on 1 second.
Okay.
It might do that periodically.
Hey, energy saving sometimes
Yeah.
takes precedence over our webinars. So I just want to touch on, we mentioned digital first. Digital critical has also come up, and I'm just curious, just as establishing the kind of cultural context you walked into. You mentioned that the leadership team was not necessarily all digital background. That said, I also imagine 350 being as a newer organization? I don't know the age range of all the people in leadership teams. I guess curious to hear a little bit more about, you know, when you say the digital literacy or competency of the broader team, is that to say people without hard skills doing the digital work but understand digital, or just actually have never, you know, didn't grow up with digital? Or I'm curious how much of that is a factor for what you walked into, but also a few people have commented just on this question of what do you mean by digital critical and digital first, and what was that cultural understanding, I guess, as a foundation?
Totally. So yeah, one thing I've talked about a lot internally is the level of digital fluency across the organization, and we have a real mix of people in the organization, you know, people who've come from much more political backgrounds, people of all ages, people who are very young and just out of, you know, education. But in terms of the founders, sure, you know, there definitely were using digital tactics in 350's inception to you know, the best of its potential, but that was 10 years ago. And it's incredibly difficult. I'm sure everyone can experiences something similar. It's incredibly difficult to do your day-to-day work and also keep on top of, like, oh God, what are other organizations doing? What's best practice? What tool are they doing that with? I have no idea. You know, it's really hard. And I think that's one great thing about the MobilisationLab newsletter in terms of like shining a light and giving some exposure to what everyone's doing. But unless you can block out an hour or two every week to keep up and do some learning, how are you not going to fall behind? And that's hard. And I think if leadership particularly feels like they don't quite have their head around like what's needed, you're always going to err on the side of caution, I think, habitually, and not make the big investments. And the reality is tech tools cost a lot of money. And unless you have the context of how much other organizations are spending on certain things, I think it's easy for like those quotes, those numbers to come back and to balk at them and be like, what? In what world would we spend that money? But unless you are making those investments year on year, you're just going to be hit with a huge bill, you know, down the road. And I think it's sort of understanding that. In terms of being digital critical, what do I mean? I guess one of the main things that I've been trying to hammer home over the last year is the need to be a lot more data informed. So, you know, you don't have to be data driven all the time. You don't have to capitulate to what the data tells you all the time. You have your own strategy that you want to follow. But, you know, what you don't want to happen is people spending an hour on a call editing an email, like one email that they're not going to test, but they really want to send out. Or people sort of making sort of assumptions about their supporters and what they want without ever asking them. And I think that is really what I mean, like sort of integrating some of that more data informed thinking to help us make better decisions. Because at the end of the day, I think so much of what this process has been about is trying to get us to a place where we can make better and faster decisions.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, that's the sort of thing that we want everyone in the organization to be asking and doing, not just something that's isolated in a siloed digital department.
Totally, yeah.
So let's go there. I mean, I'd love to let's dive right into that vision of, you know, you told us a bit about what you found. So then what was the solution then that you started proposing and socializing internally?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a bit more context about the things that weren't working. So I think I've touched on the fact that 350, was in a pretty huge amount of technical debt. You know, we had people were making email lists all over the shop. They weren't synced with each other. And so our reports weren't accurate. And we have a lot of, something that we do really well, I think, is making content that we hadn't kept up with the sort of changes in tactics around sort of paid promotion and things like that, as well as the data informed decision making. So in terms of solutions, I wanted us to get really clear on what we meant by digital at 350, and what I landed on was thinking about it in 3 buckets.
Okay.
One bucket was around tools and tool set, and that involves, okay, we actually need a CRM. We can't just have 5 million spreadsheets on different people's individual laptops. And also having like a multilingual tool set that really works for our volunteers around the world who are going to be using it to organize their local groups. The second bucket was strategy. So making sure that the right people were at the table at the very beginning when it came to sort of formulating strategy, and not just being handed a sort of to-do list of digital tactics that may or may not help that campaign reach its goal. And trying to really integrate this data informed decision making throughout the organization, and through especially our programmatic team and initiatives. And then the third bucket was a megaphone. And this is about, you know, really making sure that the content that 350 is making finds its audience. So investing more in paid promotion, building up a sort of multimedia team, so bringing some video producers in-house. I'm saying all of this and I'm so glad I don't have to think about all of these pieces anymore. But and sort of moving away from more static content like blogs, which had become a habitual response for campaigners and organizers, rather than maybe doing like a Facebook live stream or an Instagram story or something like that.
So yeah, so you sounds like you have you introduced this new strategy and the concept before talking about structural changes, is what I'm hearing, right? That they needed a broad strategic approach that said, this is what we need to be doing, that integrated data is going to be important. We can't have, we need a different approach to communicating and engaging people. That's a more holistic, taking a step back. And then, so it sounds like there's a form follows function.
Yes. So then I came upon 2 recommendations that I made I would also like to add that how I landed on those 3 buckets and the thought behind it wasn't an agenda that I came into 350 with. I really came with a blank slate. I had no idea. It's like, I don't know, I really want to find out what the spirit is, within the organization and what people are open to. And so I did 40 one-on-one interviews with key staff, and I sent a survey to all staff and got 45 responses. And then I also interviewed 15 key stakeholders externally, including like funders, board members, or other partners. And so what I landed on with the recommendations was just a reflection of what everyone was saying. It was like themes, and then through my filter of like, okay, so with what I know, like what might make sense. And so I had landed on those 3 buckets regardless. And then I went to the leadership team and I was like, okay, we can achieve those things using 2 different structures, and they both have pros and cons. One is like a centralized structure. I could build an empire, right? Either way, we need to hire a lot more people, get a lot more capacity in, and do a lot more training. I could build a digital empire that means that my team expands to twice the size, and we are given a bit more ability and weight to sort of have more autonomy to try things out. The other option was to like do sort of the opposite of building an empire, sort of like give it all away. So it's like, okay, where do some of these people really truly belong? Where would you put them if you were going to start an organization from scratch right now? In a comms team, lots of people, comms teams now include digital engagement and digital strategy, but 350s didn't. It was like sort of traditional print media. But what would it mean to include social media and video production in the comms team, and how would that break down the silo that then existed between comms and digital? And what would it mean for digital organizers and campaigners to really be embedded in the program team, be in the room when conversations about strategy were happening at a very early stage, and be able to input and say, actually, this tactic might work well here. you know, and really sort of be thought partners. And either way, in both scenarios, we really did need to build this product team that was going to be a lot more focused on bringing our tool set up to scratch, and not just hoping that like 1.5 developers were going to carry the whole weight of a 200-person organization, which was the reality last year.
So can you tell us more about how you came to the conclusion that I think maybe for many of us listening, we can imagine that first part where, and I guess there's been a few articles too. I know you've written about this. There was a post a while back from Sam Dorman about detangling the words digital on the Mob website as well, about what is like a post. You know, we don't have departments of telephones, we don't have departments of paper. Like, are we at that point? We don't need a department of digital because it's everything and everywhere. So I imagine those of us who all work in these spaces and these organizations can imagine, wow, if only that comms officer knew how to do this thing themselves, if only there was an IT department to support the Zoom setup, and if only, you know, the field and organizing and volunteers team had more tools to cut that list and figure out who's most engaged and communicate with them in various ways. But you're also you're talking a lot about this product teams as well, which I think is probably new for a lot of us, and I know comes from it's not typical in our sector, right?
Yeah.
So tell us more about what you mean by hiring all these developers, and why do you need that? Aren't there all these tool sets that exist and do everything we need?
Absolutely. And shout out, to Sam Dorman and Chris Zaitzer from the Build Tank, who I should say we've worked with 2 consultancies over the last year to help us with this transformation. One is the Build Tank, who specialize in helping organizations build product teams. And the other one is Forward Action, and they help sort of build paid promotion programs. So why a product team? So I had been product team adjacent at some of us, who'd had a product team for some years. Okay. I know that other organizations on this call also now have product teams. I think the ACLU has built one. What's the point? The point is, so another thing I'll add is
Mm-hmm.
in my pitch was a non-negotiable, which was hiring IT support that would sit in operations.
Separate from,
So Mohammed has started, and he is excellent, and he is really fielding all the Zoom, Slack, Google Docs, hardware questions that we were before, which is such a dream. But when it comes to other tools, you know, even if they're third-party tools, so we use Action Kit, Action Network, Control Shift, New Mode. Those are our sort of main campaigns and organizing tools at the moment. Those need stewardship. You know, you can't just set them up and leave them running. And they're, you know, they have occasional bugs. They don't meet all your needs. They'll need custom development. 350 is incredibly complex. You know, we have all these teams who need different languages, different segmentations of things. And there's just no world in which you can successfully be like, cool, here's a login, good luck. But that was what was happening, just because no one had any time last year, and you need a lot of training for people's lives to not be frustrating, and for them not to be spending 2 hours a day being like, all I want is to download these petition signatures, but I have no idea how, and no one can show me.
Yeah, and I mean, and personally, I just think some of these product owners would have you believe that there's no additional work needed. But in any advanced strategy like yours, right, where you have multiple things going on in different places and creative tactics, I think would require, sometimes you need special functionality or things to talk to each other in ways that doesn't work out. So that makes sense to me. I guess, could you, just to bring this to life even more, can you give us a sense of, you know, I know you're still building this out in many ways, and you've done a ton of recruiting and set up at this point. What does it look like either now or in the near future when the vision is realized? Like, what's a day in the life of the product teams, meets campaigns, meets however, meets digital?
So what I might do is share my screen again and show you the product team structure. Oh, hold on. Oh no, that's just a Google Doc. That's where I can't go. Can you see this?
Yes.
Structure. Okay, great.
Nice.
So the product team officially established in January of this year, and that was when I kind of moved into this chief product officer role. And I should also say that you know, I've had a dream scenario where I've really been given the backing by the leadership team and the resources to make all this a reality. So I was able to hire a digital engagement director who was in the comms, who has moved into the comms team and is overseeing all of the digital engagement stuff. And we've just hired a digital organizing and campaigns director who will sit in program and oversee the digital strategy. So that's really allowed me to sort of move over here and focus on product.
Hence your new title, huh?
Yeah. And so we're divided into 4 sections: data, web, organizing and campaigns tools, and CRM. And a product team really can look different in different organizations. I know in other places, you know, it could be that you have 20 engineers and they're all building stuff in-house, but that's really not 350's reality, because we'd need a team of like 400 engineers to build everything that people ask. So most people are concentrating on stewarding third-party tools. We do build, we're building a sort of map called the Mega Map in-house, which is currently tracking all of our all of the global climate strikes events and things like that, but that's really the main tool we build in-house. Anyway, so day in the life, we try and run it in an agile way. So we have stand-ups via a Geekbot that integrates with Slack every day. We have a weekly sort of priorities meeting and another weekly meeting where we really just pile on and try and solve each other's problems in a pretty open-ended way. So many of the things that we work on are extremely cross-cutting, you know, data and web and organizing campaigns tools will have to be involved in lots of conversations to do with the global climate strikes, for example, right now. And so all of that's working really well. It's an amazingly, well, it's just a brilliant, high-functioning team. And our philosophy is really to go out and talk to as many people as possible, as often as possible. We don't want to just sit there and wait for people to be like, hey, can you help us with this? We try to be proactive, try and find out what issues people are having now and what they foresee coming down the road. And that's why you'll see here, we have 2 roles that are incredibly focused on trainings. So we have one woman, Katie Cashman, who her sole focus at the moment is in skilling up people in digital skills across the organization, not just people with digital responsibilities. And then Andrea, whose role involves a lot of coaching and sort of hand-holding of people in how to use our tools. Nice. And then we're rolling out Salesforce currently across the organization, and Kalelo and Bibu, a lot of their role is and will be sort of the similar training and hand-holding, because you can't just put the structures in place and expect people to catch up without the support. So
just to put a finer point on it to make sure I'm understanding, and maybe the rest of us where this is just a totally new model, this is all separate from the digital, or what kind of roles are now in country offices or other teams? So what are the roles that have been decentralized alongside of all this that's not in the diagram? Because I think yes. I'm hearing some good examples about like how great your product team now is to be able to serve the needs of all the different parts of the organization with things that don't already exist or things they need help with, or keeping the organization able to achieve its strategy. But then the day-to-day, what are the functions that then you need the rest of the organization to have in place for this product team to be able to just actually specialize in the product development?
So this is outdated, this diagram, but it gives you a bit more of a sense of the whole that I proposed at the end of the digital assessment, which, by the way, that process of interviews and surveys and things, it took me 2 months when I started at 350. So it was definitely not an overnight sort of win. So all of these people would have been in one big team. if we hadn't decentralized. These are just staff members with digital responsibilities. It doesn't represent anybody else. So all of these people here, multimedia, content, member services, sort of emails, moved into comms. A lot of our regional digital campaigners and organisers already were embedded in their programme team, so it didn't affect them too much. But the global digital organising staff moved into programme. And then we've hired an online fundraising manager who development is quite separate, and at 350 we're very lucky in that, well, it depends how you look at it, but fundraising isn't really integrated into campaigns at the moment. And then we hired IT support, and then this is what we're left with here in product.
So what are we have one question that is coming in here from Michael, just about like quality, potential drops in quality when that shift was made. I realize you think some things were already decentralized actually, but which is great. But has there been a growth curve or a learning curve, or maybe that's not the right term, but a transition period where you're trying to get more people to take on new roles or things or functions that didn't previously exist and don't have that centralized ability to keep an eye on, where you're losing a bit of that central quality control role?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there wasn't a central quality control role beforehand.
Wasn't happening anyway. Okay.
Yeah, and I think 350 is one of the amazing and chaotic things about 350 is everyone has so much autonomy. What's happening now and is an ongoing process is by introducing sort of more data informed things, by doing tests, reporting back on the learnings. We have a testing blog now that anyone can read. We have a testing Slack channel where people are encouraged to do things, tell us the results. By having reports that are accurate, by introducing metrics around, okay, we talk a lot about endorsers and followers and contributors, and now we've actually assigned sort of benchmarks and metrics to those things. The idea behind that is people will be able to have more access to understanding if what they're trying is working, which I think before was really exceptionally hard to do because their reports weren't accurate. It was hard to know what feedback loops you should be looking at. And, we didn't have sort of processes in place for sign off of things like that necessarily. And all of that is slowly being built now.
I want to see if we can get some of your thoughts on how your experience here translates to people trying to figure this out for themselves. And I know you've had a ton of learnings, which are probably valuable for those of us. We have I'll give you a couple of questions here to think about at once. One from Anil in Canada is asking about what's in-house versus out of house? What do you keep in? What can be outsourced nowadays? And the other, I think another big question that you touched on, Ezra here, how do you bring, and someone in New Zealand as well, how do you bring people along? What is the spark here that is necessary to get people on board with this because you're asking people to do something different, right, than the way they've been comfortable working probably in a lot of cases.
Yeah, totally. I'll quickly answer the first question, which is in terms of in-house and outsourcing, I think what you want to keep in-house is the steward. You want the sort of product owner in-house. And then you can outsource all the sort of day-to-day, whatever, outsource data engineering or outsource bits of coding or things like that. But you really want you want an owner internally. In terms of how to bring people along and how you might apply this thinking to your organization, I want to share 2 slides again. So, can you see this?
Yeah, I got it.
Great. So this is from the Social Transformation Project. It's an organizational transformation tool called the Wheel of Change. And it talks about these three sort of buckets of things you want to hit when you're trying to make a wholesale shift in an organization, which are hearts and minds, behaviors and structures. And that you really have to do all three to make a change last and stick. Something like 70% of internal change initiatives fail in organizations. And a lot of that can be attributed to, okay, maybe you just changed everything but didn't explain why or consult people. Maybe you've done a lot of focus on training people up, but they're not really empowered to make the decisions, you know, to apply that learning. Or maybe you're just having a lot of conversations but not changing anything. I find this a really helpful tool. The other thing I wanted to share.
We're a fan of that one as well.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to share was, you know, that every organization is different. I think if I had walked into any other organization, I would have come to a different conclusion, but the method would have been the same, which was to build a watertight case for change. And, you know, because I was doing that work of interviewing people and reflecting it back, there wasn't really anything, you know, they were just saying things back to themselves. There wasn't me bringing an agenda to it that that could kind of be resisted all that much. Using change management processes I've hit, and then you know, I was lucky, like I said, to be in a situation where I was on the leadership team and had resources that that maybe the ED was willing to sort of apply to this process. But lots of people I know are not in this position. So I think if you can just think of the one next thing that you need, it might be, you know, someone to come in and do IT support to help free up your time, or it might be a training so that everyone can make Facebook posts and not just delegate that. You know, it doesn't, if you can't make a transformational shift, I would say just shoot for an incremental one, because you may as well.
And it sounds like, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, just the last thing I would say is, like, the product team model is one that I'm bought into at the moment, but also in the understanding that 5 years from now, who knows how appropriate it will feel. And I want to ensure that we're instilling the right mindset here that means that we don't fall into the same trap again, which is sort of 5 years from now being like, oh, hold on, wait, everyone else is doing this cool thing and we haven't kept up. So, yeah.
I guess that reminds me of, we can end on this, something you wrote about, you finished one of your articles with, just about how when your structure has caught up to your mission, your organization has started to stagnate. And yeah, maybe just give, I'm sorry we're out of time, because clearly we could go for another hour here, but what are your thoughts about, can you expand upon that and just give us some thoughts, regardless of our organizational size? We all have some kind of structures or forms that we're dealing with. How do we know when it's time to shift or try something different?
I think you have to have relationships outside of your organization and outside of your context. And I think you'll know, because you're going to be confronted by what other people are doing. I mean, you don't just have to follow the crowd, but you will be like, oh, you know, have some sort of like thoughts or roads to go down. And unless you're really challenging yourself to do that, I think, I mean, honestly, the other thing is, it all comes back to impact. You know, you'll know that you're stagnating when you see that your impact is falling. If what you're doing is working, by all means, absolutely stick with it and don't change. But at the end of the day, it's all about the output and the work and the real world impact it's having. And if you see that not reaching where you want to be, then that would be the moment.
And I really appreciate that about the beginning of your story, where I guess you and the organization were willing to say, hey, maybe we're not fit for purpose anymore. We're not achieving the goals that we wanted under the current ways of working. So thank you for sharing all of your, I guess that means it's time to stop.
It's time to go.
We're shutting it down. I just want to, on behalf of, I think, everyone here, appreciate your candor, sharing so much of behind the scenes with us. And I know there are many of us who are excited to continue following the story, because you have one of the most exciting ones for so many of us to learn from. So we will do what we can here at MobLab to support that ongoing learning.
Thank you.
To the extent that you're willing to keep sharing with us all. And I know we have a lot of links posted here. We are going to send out a recap for those of you who asked about it. And obviously we have some of the shared notes.
And I want to say, you know, if anyone wants to pick my brains about something, you're absolutely welcome to reach out to me on Twitter or email me as well. It's hannah@350.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for taking the hour here to join us. Hopefully this is the first of future additional conversations like this. But of course, a huge round of applause. I see the thanks coming in on the chat to you, Hanna, and I will echo all that as well, because I learned a bunch and I know everyone here did too. So
thank you so much.
Until we talk again. Thanks, Hanna.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.